What's going on, everybody? Anthony Cervino here on a RotoWire Fantasy Football YouTube channel with my way too early top 12 fantasy football wide receivers for 2025. Number 12, Jaxon Smith-Njigba. Jaxon Smith-Njigba finished as the PPR wide receiver 9 and the wide receiver 17 in fantasy points per game. He did this while sharing a wide receiver room with the likes of Tyler Lockett, who's getting a little bit older, and DK Metcalf battled injuries. And in my opinion, JSN is the more complete wide receiver, and we saw him ascend to the top of the wide receiver chart this year. Number 12th amongst his position in targets, number 1 in slot snaps. He was also number 7 in receptions with 100, 10th in receiving yards, and 7 in yak. There's going to be a little bit of change. They fired Grubb in Seattle. There's going to be a new incoming offensive coordinator. We assume that Geno Smith is going to be back. And if that's the case, then I like JSN to remain as the top wide receiver in Seattle. And I'm willing, at least right now, to take him as a 12 wide receiver off the board. Up next, Ladd McConkey. Ladd McConkey was simply outstanding in his rookie campaign. In a low-volume passing attack, Ladd McConkey finished as the wide receiver 12 in PPR and the wide receiver 16 in points per game. And while he was a little bit erratic to start the year, Ladd McConkey was absolutely electric down the stretch. Since week 11, he was a wide receiver 24 or better on the week in every single game down the stretch. Plus, he went absolutely crazy in the playoff loss to Houston. Ladd McConkey is the real deal. He's a PPR machine, and he's also has the ability to make the big play. Finished the year number 6 in slot snaps, but he's versatile. He can line up on the perimeter as well. He also had the 9th most receiving yards this year and 7th in yards per route run and 8th in yards per target. We know that he's married to one of the better young quarterbacks in the NFL in Justin Herbert, and we believe that in year 2 in this Greg Roman offense, we could see more ceiling and more consistency from Ladd McConkey. I do expect the Chargers to bring in some wide receiver help. I do expect them to help their running back room. But barring a guy like T. Higgins, I expect Ladd McConkey to remain the de facto wide receiver 1 for the Chargers in 2025 and beyond. Next up, this might surprise you. I'm going with T. Higgins as my number 10 wide receiver. T. Higgins this year. Yes, wide receiver 17, but when it comes to points per game, he was the wide receiver 5. T. Higgins, 18.5 points per game in 12 games played. Yes, we worry about injuries with T. Higgins. Yes, we don't know the landing spot. It's a long shot that he ends up back in Cincinnati, which means he's going to go to another team and take over as the wide receiver 1. And I believe T. Higgins, if he's healthy and he lands in the right offense, T. Higgins could emerge as one of the top fantasy football wide receivers because he will no longer be sharing a wide receiver room with Jamarr Chase. We've seen T. Higgins do it all this year. They leaned on him with targets. He's made the big play. He's won them games down the stretch in must-win spots to keep Cincinnati in a playoff hunt. When it comes to what this guy does best, he can do it all pretty well. He was 5th amongst wide receivers in receiving touchdowns. He was 5th with red zone targets. He had 24, hauling in 14 of them. T. Higgins is a legitimate weapon inside the red zone. 6'4", 216. He's a big body in the red zone, and I expect that to continue with whatever team he ends up with. Think about if T. Higgins landed with a team like the Broncos with Bo Nix. What if he landed in New England? I get it. It's New England, but there's also Drake May, a young ascending quarterback. What if the Green Bay Packers, and I get it, they have a couple of dudes in the wide receiver room, but they don't have a wide receiver 1. They invested in Jordan Love. They keep knocking on the door in the playoffs. What they're missing is a game-changing wide receiver. T. Higgins could be it. Let's go to my number 9 wide receiver, and that's A.J. Brown, folks. A.J. Brown this year, hate to call him a bust, but he did not live up to expectations because of Saquon Barkley. Playing in 13 games, A.J. Brown, wide receiver, 12 fantasy points per game. Still performing at a high level, but only the wide receiver 20 in PPR. Those numbers would be a little bit better if he played the other few games that he missed. Still wound up with 97 targets, but only 67 receptions, over 1,000 yards receiving, and 7 receiving touchdowns. He was number 2 in his position in air yard share, number 2 in target share. Remember, Philly is a low-volume team passing, especially with Saquon Barkley there. But when he's on the field, A.J. Brown runs routes. He was number 1 in route participation. He was also outstanding when it comes to some of his efficiency metrics. He was 4th in yards per target, 9th in yards per reception, and the number 1 in receiver in yards per team pass attempt, number 2 in yards per route run. We know what A.J. Brown can do. He's one of the best wide receivers in the NFL. If he was in a high-volume passing attack, he could be in the conversation to finish as a top 3 wide receiver. I do think playing in Philly, what Hurts and Saquon hinders his ceiling, but I'm still comfortable taking him as a number 9 wide receiver off the board. Next up, Brian Robinson Jr. Brian Robinson Jr., he defines quarterback proof. He defines system proof. Played on a Jacksonville offense that couldn't get out of its own way. It couldn't run the ball. It dealt with injuries. But all Brian Thomas Jr. did this season was produce, whether it was Trevor Lawrence or Mac Jones down the stretch. BTJ was a league winner for fantasy football managers. And next year, there's not going to be the Doug Peterson system. There isn't going to be the Press Taylor system. If Jacksonville does it right and brings in an offensive-minded head coach and a legitimate coordinator, the Jaguars have enough tools and skill players on this offense to make a lot of noise. And Brian Thomas Jr., you better believe he's going to be a big-time part of it. He was 3rd at the wide receiver position in receiving yards, 4th in yards after the catch, 5th in touchdowns. All of this with subpar quarterback play. In fact, you can make the case that Mac Jones is the best quarterback on the field for the Jacksonville Jaguars this season. He got off to a little bit of a slow start, but down the stretch, Brian Thomas Jr. finished as a top 20 wide receiver or better in every game he played since week 13. Brian Thomas Jr., if they get it right in Jacksonville, he could be flirting with a top 5 ceiling. Next up, we're going to Puka Nacua, and there are some question marks I have about Puka Nacua. Could this be the year that Matthew Stafford retires? And if it is, what does that quarterback room look like, which could hinder Puka Nacua? Now, Puka, wide receiver 26, but there's some points left on the table because he only played in 11 games. But in the games he did play, he was simply outstanding. 18.8 fantasy points per game. The number 2 wide receiver in that category. He was an absolute monster. 4th in target share, 1st in target rate. He was also number 1 in yards per route run. Number 3 in yards per team pass attempt. Puka Nacua literally was the passing attack for the Rams down the stretch. While Cooper Kupp was barely a blip on the radar, Cooper Kupp looks like a descending asset, while Puka Nacua looks like one of the best young wide receivers in the NFL. You have to look at his target share down the stretch. He had 2 games since week 14 with at least 14 targets and didn't have below 8 targets in a single game since week 9. As long as everything stays the same for the Rams, I am fully okay with taking Puka Nacua where I have him ranked now or even higher. Again, the offseason will dictate a lot of it. Next up, I'm going with Nico Collins. I'm all in on Nico Collins. Now, there's a disclaimer with Nico Collins. He deals with injuries. He has not played a full season without injury ever in his young NFL career. But when he's on the field, we know that Nico Collins is an absolute monster. The wide receiver 8 in fantasy points per game, 6'4", 215, terrific speed. He's a playmaker. He's a game changer, and he can do everything all over the football field, whether it's in the red zone. He can make big plays with the ball in his hands. When it comes to opportunity, 9th in target rate. When it comes to effectiveness, as you can see, didn't dominate in deep targets, didn't dominate in the red zone targets. He's just a complete wide receiver. Now, with CJ Stroud, I get it. There's some growing pains. CJ Stroud did take a step back this season. But looking ahead to next year, Tank Dell, we assume he's going to be back at some point coming off the injury. We don't know what's going to go on with Stephon Diggs, but we do know Nico Collins will be there, and no matter what they do at the wide receiver position, Nico Collins will be the featured asset. If we get a full season or close to it out of Nico Collins, and we see CJ Stroud play like he did in his rookie year, it would not shock me at all if Nico Collins finishes as a top 3 wide receiver. My 5th ranked wide receiver, Malik Nabors, similar to Brian Thomas Jr. Malik Nabors played quarterback-proof football. He made it happen with Daniel Jones. He made it happen with Drew Lock. The Giants, they're a mess on offense. They need to hit on quarterback. They need to get things right altogether. But Malik Nabors, he's the one thing that they have going for them. He played in 15 games, but Malik Nabors dominated. Now, is his ceiling capped because of the offensive and quarterback deficiency? Sure. But he is good enough to overcome, which we've seen quite a few times this year. Number 2 amongst wide receivers in targets, number 1 in target share. He had 170 targets this year, 11.3 per game. He was 3rd in receptions, 7th in yards receiving, 11th in YAC. He only had 7 touchdowns. Again, I blame that on the poor offense. He was even 5th in deep targets. They took their shots. And if some of those targets were better quality, we could have seen a overall wide receiver 1 finish out of Malik Nabors in his rookie year. Instead, he ends as the wide receiver 6 in PPR and the wide receiver 6 in PPR points per game. Regardless of what the Giants do at quarterback, whether they bring in a rookie, whether they bring in a bridge like Kirk Cousins, I'm willing to go all in on Malik Nabors, because as long as they keep targeting him, and I fully believe Brian Daboll knows that Malik Nabors is this entire offense, then expect Malik Nabors to once again perform at a high level in fantasy. Number 4, Amon-Ra St. Brown this year, wide receiver 3 overall, or wide receiver 4 in points per game. In fact, he's finished as a wide receiver 4 in points per game in 2 years in a row. Despite the emergence of Jameson Williams, we still had a big year out of Amon-Ra St. Brown. He was the 8th in targets, 2nd in receptions, 5th in receiving yards, and 3rd in touchdowns. He had 12 touchdowns, 2 more than he had last season. We know the offense that he's attached to, and there's a good chance that Ben Johnson takes a job elsewhere, but I think this Lions team, they have enough pieces. They have Jared Goff to where even losing Ben Johnson, I don't think this offense or Amon-Ra St. Brown, I don't think they skip a beat. Amon-Ra also played in 17 games. First time since his rookie year where he played a full season. He's one of the more consistent, high-floor wide receivers you can draft. He's a can't-miss pick, barring injury. Number 3, I'm going CeeDee Lamb. I see a lot of other analysts rank CeeDee Lamb a little bit further back. I'm not going to do that. He's getting Dak Prescott back. And even with Dak injured and the offense not playing great, and he had Cooper Rush for a lot of games, we still had a wide receiver 8 finish out of CeeDee Lamb in PPR. He was also the wide receiver 7 in points per game, despite only playing in 15 games. This showed me, because I'm a Cowboys fan, I had questions about CeeDee Lamb without Dak. CeeDee Lamb proved me wrong. I was ready to bury CeeDee Lamb. He was a sell candidate without Dak Prescott for me. He proved me wrong. Now, we were missing some of those big spike weeks down the stretch without Dak Prescott, but he also brought a high floor to the table, very similar to Malik Nabors, that even without a quarterback ace under center, as long as you hyper target talents like Lamb, they are going to deliver in fantasy. They also use CeeDee Lamb more this year as a runner. Dallas found ways to get the football in his hands. I get Mike McCarthy's not going to be there. I fully expect the Cowboys to get it right at offensive coordinator, possibly bring on an offensive-minded head coach and exploit the capabilities of what CeeDee Lamb potentially brings to the table. Number 2, I'm going with Justin Jefferson. Justin Jefferson finishes the wide receiver 2 this year. Overall, the wide receiver 3 in points. And we know there's a debate. Is Justin Jefferson de facto number 1 wide receiver in the NFL and fantasy football? To me, no. You know who I have in front of him, but he's still one of the best. We saw an outstanding season out of Jordan Addison this year, but still, Jefferson, 4th in targets, 3rd in target share. He's always going to have that opportunity. He also was 5th in red zone targets. Justin Jefferson, 6'1", 202, not the biggest body in the world, but he finds ways to get open in the red area. And Sam Darnold found a way to get him the football. 5th in total touchdowns, 2nd in receiving yards, 6th in yards after the catch. We know the efficiency metrics are off the charts for Justin Jefferson. Now, will I discount Jefferson if they go with J.J. McCarthy next year? I'm not going to lie, I probably will. But if Sam Darnold is back in year 2 in this system with Justin Jefferson, I'm fully expecting another elite year out of Jefferson. Number 1 wide receiver, you know who it is, Jamarr Chase. I'm a Jamarr Chase guy. Jamarr Chase is attached to Joe Burrow, who I believe, outside of Patrick Mahomes, is the most talented and best quarterback in the NFL. And as long as Burrow is healthy, you know what he's going to do with Jamarr Chase. He's going to force feed him the football. If you watch some of these games, some of the throws that Burrow makes to Chase, the rapport that these two guys have since their collegiate years, it reminds me of Aaron Rodgers and Devontae Adams. It is next level. Chase finishes the wide receiver 1 in points per game and overall. Number 1 in targets. He was number 1 in red zone targets and also 17 in deep targets. He had 17 total touchdowns, did Jamarr Chase. Number 1 in that category. That was a career high by far. Number 1 across the board when it comes to production. Number 1 in receptions, receiving yards, yak, touchdowns, fantasy production. This is an elite wide receiver. And I know it's hard to repeat as the number 1 wide receiver year after year. But I am banking on Jamarr Chase to do just that as long as we get another healthy year out of Joe Burrow.